My name is Loretta May Calloway, and I am 58 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a licensed land surveyor in Harlan County, Kentucky. And for 31 years, my sister Darlene told anyone who would listen that our grandmother's 47 acres of ridge land belonged to her alone. She had a deed she'd drawn up herself, notarized by a man who turned out to be her husband's fishing buddy. And she had already sold mineral rights on 11 of those acres to a coal extraction company for $340,000 before I ever found out the property had changed hands at all. I want you to understand the scale of what she had done. 47 acres of ridge land in Harlan County, Kentucky. Sounds modest until you understand that the same ridge sits above a seam of metallurgical coal that 3 separate companies had been circling for a decade. The assessed value of the full parcel at the time of the contested transfer was $1.2 million. The mineral rights alone, on all 47 acres, had been independently appraised at $890,000. Darlene had moved fast, and she had moved quietly, and by the time our grandmother, Nettie Calloway, passed away on March 4th, 2019, at the age of 89, Darlene had already positioned herself to collect every dollar of it. She had told the family that Nettie left everything to her. She had told the coal company the same thing. She had told our cousin Brenda, our Aunt Paulette, and the pastor at First Baptist of Loyal that the land had been Nettie's final wish, that Nettie had signed the transfer herself, that I had been estranged from the family for years and had no claim. What Darlene didn't know was that I had spent 31 years measuring land for a living. I knew exactly what a fraudulent deed looked like. And I had a cedar box with a brass latch sitting in the back of my hall closet that Nettie had handed me herself, 12 years before she died, with instructions I had followed to the letter. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you to take just a moment and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This channel exists because of people like you, and every one of those clicks matters more than you know. Drop your city and what time it is where you are in the comments. I love reading those. Every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really begins. To a 2-room house on Catron Creek Road. And a little girl who learned very early that love in her family was not distributed equally. My mother, Vera Calloway, was a practical woman in the way that poverty makes people practical. She worked the lunch shift at the Harlan Diner 6 days a week and came home smelling of bacon grease and dishwater. And she was not a cruel woman. I want to be fair to her memory. She was not cruel. She was just partial. And she had been partial since the day Darlene was born, 2 years before me, with their father's blue eyes and their father's easy smile. And she had never once tried to hide it. Darlene got the bedroom with the window that faced the morning sun. I slept in the back room where the wallpaper was water-stained and the radiator knocked all winter. Darlene got new school clothes every August from the JCPenney in Middlesboro, a 40-minute drive my mother made willingly. I wore what Darlene outgrew. And what Darlene outgrew was usually worn through at the elbows and faded to a color that had no name. When Darlene turned 16, my mother threw her a party in our backyard with a sheet cake from the Piggly Wiggly and 17 people from church. When I turned 16, my mother made me a single cupcake with a birthday candle she had to light twice because the first one broke. And she set it on the kitchen table before her shift and said, "There you go, Loretta May," and left. I don't tell you that to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you that because it is the ground everything else grew out of. My father, Raymond Calloway, worked the mines until his lungs gave out when I was 9. After that, he sat in the front room and watched television and occasionally said things that weren't unkind but weren't particularly directed at anyone either. He was a quiet man hollowed out by the work and the dust. And I loved him in the way you love someone you can see is already leaving. He passed when I was 14. Darlene cried for 3 days. I helped my mother sort his things into boxes because someone had to. What I had, in place of the Morning Sun bedroom and the JCPenney clothes and the sheet cake, was Nettie. Nettie Calloway was my father's mother, and she lived 11 minutes up the road in a white frame house with a covered porch and 2 rocking chairs and a garden that ran along the south side of the property in rows so straight they looked surveyed. She was a small woman with large hands and gray hair she kept pinned up with the same 4 tortoiseshell clips her whole life. And she smelled of lavender hand cream and would smoke and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as the smell of someone who has thought carefully about everything. I spent every Saturday of my childhood at Nettie's house, while Darlene stayed home and watched television and painted her nails and called boys on the telephone. I walked the 11 minutes up Catron Creek Road with a paper bag of whatever I'd packed for lunch. And Nettie would be on the porch waiting, and we would spend the day together. She taught me to read a topographic map when I was 11. She had a set of them, old USGS surveys from the 1950s, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. And she would spread them on the kitchen table and show me how the lines told the story of the land. The land doesn't lie, Loretta May, she said to me once, when I was maybe 13. People lie. The land just sits there and tells the truth to anyone who knows how to read it. I wrote that down in a composition notebook that night. I still have it. Nettie saw what my mother was doing. She never said it plainly. She was not a woman who said things plainly when a gentler approach would serve, but she saw it. She made sure I had what I needed. New shoes once a year. School supplies in September. A $20 bill tucked into a birthday card every year, without fail. Small things. But the larger thing she gave me was the sense that I was worth seeing. When I was 17, Nettie sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she'd made strong the way I liked it and told me I should think about land surveying as a profession. She had spoken to a man she knew at the county courthouse, a licensed surveyor named Herschel Duff, who was willing to take on an apprentice. "You have the mind for it," she said. "You see the ground the way it is, not the way you wish it was. That's the rarest thing." I apprenticed under Herschel Duff for 3 years while I took my coursework at Southeast Kentucky Community College. I got my license at 21. I was the only woman in my graduating cohort of 7, and the only one from Harlan County, and I did not make a particular point of either of those facts. I just went to work. Darlene, meanwhile, married a man named Gary Fugate when she was 22. Gary was handsome in a way that required constant maintenance and charming in a way that cost other people money. He sold insurance for a while. Then he sold cars. Then he had a period where he was going to open a restaurant. Then a period where he was going to invest in a storage facility. And in between all of those periods, he and Darlene lived in a house that was slightly too large for what they could actually afford. And my mother helped them with the mortgage twice that I knew of, and probably more times than that. My mother never asked me for anything. She also never offered me anything. We had reached a kind of equilibrium of mutual distance that suited us both well enough. I came to holiday dinners. I brought a dish. I sat at the table and listened to Darlene talk about her children and Gary talk about his plans, and my mother looked at Darlene the way she had always looked at Darlene, like she was a lamp that lit the room. I drove home afterward and did not feel much either way about any of it. I had built a life that was mine. I had a small house on Miners Branch Road that I had bought at 34 with money I had saved for 6 years. I had a good truck and a set of surveying equipment I maintained with the care of someone who understood that her tools were her livelihood. I had a best friend named Carolyn Bates who was a nurse at Harlan ARH and who had been my closest person since we were both 26 and met at a continuing education seminar in Lexington and discovered we had both grown up in the same county and both had mothers who preferred our sisters. And I had Nettie. I visited Nettie every week for my entire adult life. Every Sunday afternoon. 11 minutes up Catron Creek Road. Coffee strong. 2 rocking chairs on the porch when the weather allowed. She got smaller as she got older, the way some women do, like the years were slowly returning her to something essential. But her mind stayed sharp. She knew what was happening on her land, and she knew what was happening in her family, and she knew, I believe, exactly what Darlene was capable of. In the spring of 2007, when I was 41 and Nettie was 77, she called me on a Tuesday. Not a Sunday, a Tuesday, which was unusual, and asked me to come by after work. I arrived at 5:30 in the afternoon. She was at the kitchen table with a cedar box in front of her. The box was about the size of a shoebox, maybe a little deeper, made of smooth cedar that had gone dark with age, with a brass latch on the front that had turned slightly green at the edges. She had never shown it to me before. She said, "Sit down, Loretta May." I sat. She said, "I want you to know what's in this box, and I want you to keep it. Not here. At your house. In a place where nobody will come looking." Inside the box was a document that would take me 12 years to fully understand the weight of. It was a deed of trust, properly executed and notarized by a notary whose commission I later verified was valid, transferring the 47 acres of ridgeland into a revocable living trust with Nettie as the trustee and me as the sole beneficiary upon her death. The trust had been drafted by an attorney named William Prater, whose office was in Barberville, 40 miles away, far enough that Darlene would never have known to look. There was also a letter, handwritten on Nettie's pale blue stationery, in an envelope she had sealed with red wax, with my name written on the front in her careful cursive. She said, "Don't open the letter until I'm gone. And don't tell anyone about the box. Not your mother. Not Darlene. Not Carolyn. Nobody." I said, "Nettie, what do you know?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I know my granddaughters. I know which one sees the land the way it is." I kept the box in the back of my hall closet for 12 years, behind a stack of extra blankets and a box of old surveying manuals. I thought about it sometimes. I did not open it. I trusted Nettie the way I trusted a good topographic map, completely, and without needing to understand every contour in advance. The years between 2007 and 2019 were the quiet years, and they were, in most of the ways that mattered, good ones. I had my work. I had my house. I had Carolyn, who got married in 2011 to a man named Dennis Bates, who was a high school history teacher and one of the most genuinely decent people I have ever known. I had Sunday afternoons with Nettie. I also had, starting in 2013, a man named Robert Sizemore, who was a retired civil engineer from Pineville and who had kind eyes and a steady manner, and who took me to dinner at the Harlan Steakhouse for our first date and spent most of the evening asking me questions about land surveying and actually listening to the answers. We did not rush anything. We were both in our late 40s, both people who had learned to be careful. By 2016, we were spending most of our time at one house or the other. And by 2018, we had agreed, without any particular ceremony, that we were building a life together. Nettie liked Robert. She told me so directly, which was the highest form of endorsement she offered. She said, "He looks at you like you're worth looking at." I told her that was a low bar. She said, "You'd be surprised how many men can't clear it." Nettie's health began to decline in the fall of 2018. She was 88 years old, and she had been strong for so long that the decline, when it came, felt sudden, even though it wasn't. She stopped being able to manage the porch steps. She stopped cooking. By January of 2019, she was in a hospital bed in her front room. And Darlene had begun appearing at the house with a frequency she had never managed during the years when Nettie was well and needed nothing. I noticed that. I noticed the timing of it. I did not say anything to anyone. I just kept coming on Sundays. And I held Nettie's hand, and I read to her from the Psalms because she had always loved the Psalms. And I watched my sister move through that house like someone taking inventory. On February 28, 2019, 4 days before Nettie died, I arrived for my Sunday visit and found Darlene in the kitchen with a man I didn't recognize. He was heavy-set, wearing a tan sport coat that had seen better days, and he had a leather portfolio open on the kitchen table. Darlene introduced him as a friend of Gary's who does notary work. She said they had just been helping Nettie with some paperwork. I went in to see Nettie. She was in the hospital bed, and she was tired, the kind of tired that is close to something else. I held her hand and sat with her for 2 hours. When I came back to the kitchen, the man in the tan sport coat was gone. I did not ask Darlene what had been signed. I already knew, in the way you know certain things, that something had been taken. I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen with the cedar box on the table in front of me for the first time since 2007, and I looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then I called William Prater's office in Barberville and left a message with his answering service. Nettie passed on March 4, 2019, at 7:22 in the morning. I was not there. Darlene was there, and Darlene called me an hour later with the news. And her voice had in it a particular quality that I recognized, the quality of someone who is performing grief over a phone call they have been waiting to make. I went to Nettie's house that afternoon. Darlene was already there with Gary and their daughter Missy. And the energy in the house was the energy of people who believe they have just inherited something. Darlene told me, in the front room, with Gary standing behind her, that Nettie had left the property to her. She said Nettie had signed a deed transfer the previous week. She said she was sorry if that was hard to hear, but that it had been Nettie's clear wish. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "All right, Darlene." She seemed surprised that I didn't argue. Gary looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as the expression of a man who had expected a fight and was slightly disappointed not to get one. I drove home. I called William Prater's office again. I reached him directly this time, and he confirmed that the trust was valid, properly recorded with the Knox County Register of Deeds as a secondary instrument in 2007, and that he had already been notified of Nettie's passing by a letter she had instructed him to open upon receiving word of her death. He said, "Mrs. Calloway was a thorough woman. Everything is in order." I want to pause here for a moment, because I've been getting messages from viewers who ask me how I stayed calm through all of this. How I sat in that front room with Darlene and Gary and said, "All right," and drove home without saying everything I knew. And I want to be honest with you, it wasn't easy. There were nights in those weeks after Nettie died when I sat in my kitchen and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but was somewhere between the two. A kind of cold, settled weight. What kept me steady was Nettie herself. She had prepared this. She had thought it through for 12 years. The least I could do was trust the plan she had made and follow it the way she had taught me to follow a survey line. Carefully, accurately, without deviation. If you've ever had someone in your family take something that wasn't theirs to take, and I mean really take it, look you in the eye and lie about it, drop the word Cedar in the comments. I want to know how many of you are out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This community is something I'm genuinely grateful for every single day. Now, back to the story. I opened Nettie's letter the night of March 4th, 2019, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Robert's hand on my shoulder. The letter was 4 pages, written in Nettie's careful cursive on pale blue stationery. And I'm not going to read you every word of it, because some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you what she said about the land. She wrote, "I have known for some time that Darlene has been watching this property the way Gary watches anything he thinks he can sell. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because you deserve to know that I saw it, and I made sure it would not stand. The 47 acres are yours. Loretta May. They have been yours in trust since 2007. I chose you not because you are my favorite, though I will not pretend you are not, but because you are the one who knows what land is worth. Not in dollars. In truth." She also wrote, at the bottom of the 3rd page, "William Prater has a second envelope. He will know when to give it to you." I met with William Prater in his Barberville office on March 11th, 2019. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck and a manner that reminded me of Herschel Duff. The manner of someone who has spent a career being careful with other people's most important things. He gave me the second envelope. Inside was a 12-page document that Nettie had prepared in January of 2019, when she still had the clarity to direct it. A detailed accounting, with attached exhibits, of every interaction she had witnessed or been made aware of between Darlene, Gary, and the coal company that had been circling the ridge land. There were copies of letters. There were records of phone calls logged by Nettie herself in a small spiral notebook. Dates and times and names, going back to 2016. There was a copy of the deed Darlene had signed on February 28th, which Nettie had somehow obtained a copy of. William Prater told me she had asked her home health aide to photograph it while Darlene was in the kitchen. The fraudulent deed had been notarized by a man named Clifton Sparks, whose notary commission, when I checked the Kentucky Secretary of State's database, had expired in November of 2018, 4 months before he notarized the document. An expired notary commission renders a notarization void. The deed was, legally speaking, not worth the paper it was printed on. I want you to understand what I felt sitting in William Prater's office with those 12 pages in my hands. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter than that. I felt the presence of a woman who had loved me carefully and specifically, and had spent the last years of her life making sure that love had teeth. I spent the next 4 months working with William Prater and a title attorney he brought in from Lexington named Sandra Okafor. We filed the necessary documents to assert the trust's claim to the property. We filed a complaint with the Kentucky Secretary of State's office regarding Clifton Sparks. We sent a certified letter to the coal company informing them that the mineral rights transfer Darlene had executed was contested and potentially void, and that any further development activity on the property should cease, pending resolution. The coal company's attorneys responded within 11 days. They were not pleased. They had paid $340,000 for mineral rights on 11 acres, and they had done so in good faith, relying on a deed that turned out to be fraudulent. That was not my problem legally, but it became Darlene's problem very quickly. Darlene did not contact me during those 4 months. I assumed she had no idea what was happening, because the legal actions were filed quietly and the certified letters went to the coal company and to the county courthouse, not to her directly. Not yet. The confrontation, when it came, was not one I sought. It was one I was invited to. In late July of 2019, I received a phone call from my cousin Brenda Calloway, who was Nettie's other granddaughter through a different son, and who had always been the family's designated peacemaker. Brenda told me that the family was having a gathering at the Harlan Elks Lodge on August 10th, a memorial dinner for Nettie, 5 months after her passing. She said it would be a chance for the family to come together, to share memories, to honor Nettie properly. She said Darlene very much wanted me there. I knew what it was. It was not a memorial dinner. It was an opportunity for Darlene to consolidate the family narrative, to have everyone present when she talked about the land, to have witnesses to her version of events before my version became public record. I understood the move because I had spent 31 years reading terrain, and the terrain here was plain. I told Brenda I would be there. I spent the 10 days between that phone call and August 10th preparing. I printed the trust documents. I printed the deed of trust recorded in 2007. I printed the fraudulent deed and the documentation of Clifton Sparks's expired commission. I printed the 12-page accounting Nettie had prepared. I printed the certified letter to the coal company and their attorney's response. I printed the complaint filed with the Secretary of State's office. I organized everything into a 3-inch navy blue binder with tab dividers. 29 exhibits in order, each one labeled in the top right corner with a small adhesive tab in Nettie's favorite color, which was yellow. I wore a navy blue dress I had bought the previous spring, not expensive, simple, with pearl earrings that had been Nettie's. I wore flat shoes because I had learned over 31 years that flat shoes are what you wear when you plan to stand your ground. Robert drove me. He offered to come inside. I told him I needed to do this part alone, but that I would call him when it was time to leave. He said, "Loretta May, you are the steadiest person I have ever known." I told him Nettie taught me that. He said he knew. The Harlan Elks Lodge was a low brick building on the north end of town with a parking lot that held maybe 40 cars. When I arrived at 6:45 p.m., there were already 22 vehicles in the lot. Inside, the main room had been set with round tables covered in white paper tablecloths. And there were photographs of Nettie on a folding table near the entrance. Her garden, her porch, her 85th birthday party. I stood for a moment and looked at her face in those photographs, and I felt something settle in my chest. There were 31 people in the room. I counted them when I walked in. Family members, neighbors, people from First Baptist. A few people I didn't recognize. Darlene was at the far end of the room with Gary and Missy's husband. And she was wearing a cream-colored blouse and a coral cardigan and a Hermes scarf that I was fairly certain was new. She saw me come in, and her expression went through several things very quickly before it settled on warmth. She crossed the room and hugged me. She smelled of a perfume I didn't recognize, and her hug was the hug of someone who has already decided they have won. She said, "I'm so glad you came, Loretta May. Nettie would have wanted this." I said, "I'm sure she would have." We sat down to dinner. There was a buffet, pulled pork, green beans cooked with ham, cornbread, coleslaw, the kind of food that appears at every Harlan County gathering from funerals to birthday parties. And it smelled of the kind of cooking that is done by people who actually know how. I ate. I was calm. My hands did not shake. I noticed that. After dinner, when people had pushed their plates back and were sitting with coffee and sweet tea, Darlene stood up. She had clearly planned to make a speech. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about Nettie for several minutes, and what she said was not untrue. Nettie had been a remarkable woman, and Darlene's love for her, whatever else she had done, was probably real in its own way. Then she said that she wanted to share some news that she believed would honor Nettie's memory. She said that Nettie had left the family land to her. She said it had been Nettie's clear and documented wish. She said she planned to be a responsible steward of the property, and that she had already taken steps to ensure the land would provide for the family going forward. She didn't say mineral rights, but that was what she meant. And several people in the room who knew about the coal company nodded. She said, "Nettie trusted me with her most important legacy, and I intend to honor that trust." I sat very still. I counted to 7. Then I stood up. I said, "Darlene, I wonder if I might share something." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people sense that something they weren't expecting is about to happen. Darlene looked at me with an expression that was still performing warmth, but had something underneath it that was not warm at all. She said, "Of course, Loretta May." I had the navy blue binder on the chair beside me. I picked it up and set it on the table. I opened it to tab 1. I said, "I want to start by saying that I loved Nettie Calloway as much as anyone in this room, and I believe she loved me. I also believe she was a precise woman who documented her wishes carefully. So, I'd like to walk through what she actually put in writing." I held up the first document. I said, "This is a deed of trust, executed on April 14th, 2007, transferring the 47 acres of ridge land on Catron Creek Road into a revocable living trust. The trust names Nettie Calloway as trustee and me, Loretta May Calloway, as sole beneficiary. It was drafted by attorney William Prater of Barberville and recorded with the Knox County Register of Deeds on April 21st, 2007. The recording number is on the document if anyone wants to verify it." The room was completely silent. I could hear the ventilation system. Darlene said, "Loretta May, this is not the time or place. I said. I think Nettie would disagree. She chose this document specifically because she wanted the truth to be in the room. I turned to tab 2. I said, "This is the deed that was presented for signature on February 28th, 2019, 4 days before Nettie passed. It purports to transfer the same 47 acres to Darlene and Gary Fugate. It was notarized by a man named Clifton Sparks." I paused. I looked at Darlene. I said, "Clifton Sparks's notary commission expired on November 3rd, 2018. Under Kentucky law, a notarization performed by a person whose commission has expired is void. This deed is not legally valid." Gary Fugate stood up. He said, "Now wait just a minute." I said, "I'm not finished, Gary." I turned to tab 3. I said, "This is a complaint filed with the Kentucky Secretary of State's office on May 22nd, 2019, regarding the expired commission. This is tab 4. The response from the Secretary of State's office confirming that an investigation has been opened. Tab 5 is a letter from the coal company's attorneys, dated April 30th, 2019, acknowledging that the mineral rights transfer is under legal review." Darlene said, and her voice had changed now. It had lost the warmth and gone somewhere harder. "You had no right to go digging through Nettie's affairs. She was my grandmother, too." I said,
"She was."
"And she prepared for that." I turned to tab 6. I said, "This is a 12-page accounting prepared by Nettie Calloway in January of 2019, with attached exhibits, documenting a series of conversations and interactions she witnessed between you, Gary, and representatives of the coal company going back to March of 2016. She kept a log. Dates, times, names. Nettie was thorough." I heard someone at one of the other tables say something quietly to the person beside them. I did not look up. Gary said, "This is a family dinner. You are making a scene at a family dinner." I said, "I haven't raised my voice once, Gary." He looked around the room. He was correct that I hadn't. Several people were looking at him now instead of at me. Darlene said, "After everything I did for Nettie, I was there. I was the one who showed up every day at the end. Where were you?" I said, "I was there every Sunday for 31 years, Darlene. And I was there on February 28th, when I walked in and found a man with an expired notary commission at Nettie's kitchen table." She said, "You don't know what you're talking about." I said, "I'm a licensed land surveyor. I've spent 31 years reading documents and measuring what is real. I know exactly what I'm talking about." Darlene sat down. I watched her sit down, and I watched the moment when the performance of confidence left her face and something else came in to replace it. She looked, for just a moment, like a woman who had known on some level that this day was coming and had spent years trying not to think about it. I closed the navy blue binder. I said, "I'm not here to argue tonight. I'm here because Nettie would have wanted the truth in the room. Everything I've shown you is a matter of public record. Anyone who wants to verify can do so at the Knox County Courthouse." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Brenda Calloway, my cousin, the designated peacemaker, said in a voice that was very careful and very steady, Loretta May. I had no idea. I said. I know you didn't. Brenda. An older man at the back of the room. I recognized him as Earl Combs, who had farmed the adjacent property for 40 years and had known Nettie since before my father was born.
Said.
Nettie always said Loretta May was the one who knew the land. He said it to no one in particular. He said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and has just been confirmed. Gary left the room. I heard the door. Darlene sat very still at her table. Missy had her hand on her mother's arm and was looking at the tablecloth. I drank my sweet tea. My voice had not wavered. I noticed that too. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I know some of you watching this have sat in a room with people who took something from you and smiled while they did it. I know some of you have been the one standing at a table trying to hold yourself together while everything in you wanted to come apart. I want you to know that the calm is not something I was born with. It is something I learned from a woman who kept a spiral notebook and a cedar box and 12 years of patience because she knew the truth would matter more than the argument. If you've ever had to stand up in a room full of people and say something true that nobody wanted to hear, drop the word ridge in the comments. And if you're watching this for the first time,
Please subscribe.
I put a lot of care into these stories, and your support is what keeps this going.
Now,
Back to what happened after that night. The legal resolution took another 14 months. William Prater and Sandra Okafor filed the formal claim on the trust's behalf in September of 2019. The fraudulent deed was ruled void by the Harlan County Circuit Court on January 14, 2020. The coal company's mineral rights transfer was voided as well, and they filed a civil suit against Gary Fugate for the $340,000 they had paid, which was, as William Prater described it to me with considerable understatement, Gary's problem to manage. I did not have to orchestrate any of what followed. I simply held the documents and let the truth do what truth does when it is properly recorded and properly presented. Gary and Darlene's house, the one that was slightly too large for what they could actually afford, went on the market in March of 2020.
I don't know the details of why. I didn't ask.
Brenda told me, and I listened, and I said I was sorry to hear it, because whatever Darlene had done, I was not glad to see her in difficulty. I was glad that the land was where it belonged. Those are two different things. Clifton Sparks lost his notary commission permanently and faced a fine from the Secretary of State's office. Gary's civil liability to the coal company was settled out of court for an amount that Brenda told me was significant, though she didn't know the exact number. I didn't pursue that information. It wasn't mine to pursue. My mother called me in April of 2020. It was the first time she had called me, as opposed to me calling her, in possibly 15 years. She said, "I heard what happened at the Elks Lodge."
I said yes.
She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nettie always did know things." I said she did. My mother said, "I wasn't always fair to you, Loretta May." I said, "No,
Mama.
you weren't." She didn't say anything else about it, and neither did I. But it was the truest thing she had said to me in a very long time, and I held it carefully. My mother passed in November of 2021. I was with her. Darlene was there too, and we sat on opposite sides of the bed and held our mother's hands. And it was the closest we had been in years.
And it was enough.
It was what it was. I don't require it to have been more than that. Darlene has not apologized to me. I do not expect her to. The architecture of her life was built on a version of events in which she was the favored one, the chosen one, the one Nettie would have wanted to have the land. That architecture cannot survive an apology, and so there will not be one. I have made my peace with that. Forgiveness, I have come to understand, is not a gift you give to the person who wronged you. It is a condition you create in yourself so that the weight of their choices does not live in your body forever. The 47 acres are mine. The ridge sits above the coal seam the same way it has always sat, patient and specific, telling the truth to anyone who knows how to read it. I have not sold the mineral rights. I may never sell them. There is something in me that wants to leave the land the way Nettie left it to me, intact,
Documented.
and waiting for whoever comes next and knows how to see it clearly. Robert and I were married in June of 2021, in a small ceremony in my backyard on Miners Branch Road with 14 people and a pastor from First Baptist and Carolyn as my witness. I wore a cream dress I found at a consignment shop in Barberville for $85, and Nettie's pearl earrings, and flat shoes. Carolyn cried. Dennis gave a toast that made everyone laugh. Robert said his vows in a voice that was steady and quiet and meant every word. Carolyn told me afterward, standing on my back porch with a glass of sweet tea, Nettie would have loved this. I said I knew. I could feel it, the way you can sometimes feel the presence of people who loved you carefully, not as a ghost, not as a haunting, but as a kind of warmth in the room that has no single source. I still drive Catron Creek Road. I drive it the way I drive any survey line, slowly, paying attention, knowing that the ground holds the record of everything that has happened on it. 11 minutes from my house to the white frame house with the covered porch. The rocking chairs are still there. I sit in one of them sometimes, on Sunday afternoons,
With coffee the way she made it.
and I look at the ridge land and I think about what it means to be seen. Nettie said to me once, the last summer she was well enough to sit on the porch for a full afternoon. The thing about the truth is that it doesn't need you to defend it. It just needs you to hold it steady until the right moment. I was 49 years old, and I had been holding the cedar box in my hall closet for 8 years by then. And I understood what she meant in a way I couldn't have understood at 17. I held it steady. I held it for 12 years. And when the right moment came, I opened the binder, and I let the documents speak. And I kept my voice level. And I watched the room understand what had been true all along. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, if you were the one who got the back bedroom and the worn-out clothes and the single cupcake, if you were the one your family underestimated because you were quiet, if you have been holding something steady for years and wondering when the right moment will come, I want you to hear this. The patience is not weakness. The documentation is not coldness. The calm is not indifference. It is the most powerful thing you have. It is the thing they cannot take from you, because it does not live in a deed or a bank account or a piece of ridge land. It lives in you. Hold it steady. The land doesn't lie. Loretta May. People lie. The land just sits there and tells the truth to anyone who knows how to read it. I have read it. I am reading it still. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you feel a little less alone in something you've been carrying, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.